And so today um, we have Karen Cox, who is a professor emeritus of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And Dr. Cox is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, um, the author of 4 books, and the editor or co-editor of 2 volumes on Southern history. She has written numerous essays and articles, including an essay for the New York Times bestseller, Myth America: Historians' Take on the Biggest Legends and Lies About Our Past. Dr. Cox's books include Dixie's Daughters, The United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Preservation of the Confederate Culture, Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture, Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South. And most recently, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice, which was published in April of 2021. And it won the Michael B.R. Thomason Book Prize from the Gulf South Historical Association. And Dr. Cox is one of our 2024 summer fellows. Dr. Cox's current book in progress is Going Home: Jazz, the Great Migration, and the Forgotten Saga of the Ribbon Flood Fire. This book explores the jazz world Walter Barnes was familiar with and the Ribbon Flood Fire, a tragedy that took the lives of more than 200 African Americans in Natchez, Mississippi in 1940. When it happened, it was the deadliest flood fire in the history of the United States. I will I said, and I will do this, introduce our discussant for today, Dr. Eve Wade, who is a historian who specializes in the migration experiences of Black Americans. After many years in the Pacific Northwest, working as professor of history at Northwestern University, as a native of Chicago, she recently returned to her hometown here and is now on faculty at the Christ the King Jesuit Prep School, where she teaches social studies. Dr. Wade holds a PhD in history from the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, a master's from Roosevelt University, and a bachelor's from Northern Illinois in DeKalb. Dr. Wade has authored literature documenting the Black experience for the Journal of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Encyclopedia. Her most recent article is entitled Look for Me in the Spring: Migration Clubs and the Black Metropolis, which was published in the spring/summer edition of the Journal of Mississippi History. Dr. Wade is currently working on a book-length manuscript that documents the rise of the Southern Black metropolis.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your introduction, Allison, and thank you for your efforts on behalf of BMRC in organizing this series. I didn't know I was going to be number 1 on the block, so I'm glad to go ahead and get it done. Also, want to thank all the members of the BMRC and part of the consortium, and for everyone who's tuned in today. And especially to Eve Wade. Dr. Wade and I both got our PhDs at the same institution. And so I'm honored that she's here with me today to discuss this. When I saw the announcement for the fellowship, it just struck me that it was something that I really should apply for, because I have been grappling with a project set in Natchez, Mississippi, but there were definitely threads that took me into Chicago. And I thought, and the way to do that would be to spend time in Chicago and doing some research. And so I'm very, very grateful that I was selected to be a fellow, and I had a terrific summer. Walter Barnes is probably unfamiliar to most people. And likely because he died so young. But I want to share how I got to know Walter Barnes and why I think he's important. My project really began with the Rhythm Club fire in Natchez, Mississippi. And as Allison mentioned, there were over 200 African Americans who died in this fire, and it was considered the deadliest club fire when it happened. It is still considered in the top five of deadliest fires, according to some of the different fire associations. The picture up and to the left is the day after the fire. And Walter Barnes died in that fire. He was part of the entertainment that night, and he and some other members of his band perished in that fire. And he was just 34 years old. And the reasons for this are essentially boarded up exits, only one way out of the club, and these Spanish moss decorations that had been sprayed with a petroleum-based pesticide. And in a club where people smoke and light cigarettes, it was easy. It was almost a disaster waiting to happen. And there were fans blowing and everything. And many of the people in the club that night were young people. The average age was 24, but there were lots of high schoolers in that club that night. So who was he? Walter Barnes I'm getting a little feedback from somebody. I don't know. But just saying something. Walter Barnes was a Mississippian. He was born in Vicksburg, and he migrated to Chicago when he was just 18, right out of high school. He formed his first jazz quartet in 1926, and he was I want to try to. I'm sorry, I just lost my page here, and he was very young, and some of the first two members of that of his quartet were women. Women drummer was in his group. He formed his orchestra really young, the Royal Creolians, and recorded some songs and in 28 and 29, and which you can find on Spotify, by the way. And his orchestra played at the Chicago-ish version of the Cotton Club, not the Harlem one, that was owned by the Capone brothers, and opened Chicago Stadium with his orchestra. And then he becomes the columnist for the Chicago Defender when he's only 24 years old, the music columnist, and that was a position he held until his death in 1940. And he ends up replacing a guy named Dave Payton, who I will introduce you to a little bit in just a little bit. The archival repositories, these are the ones I went to. The University of Chicago Jazz Archive was probably the most important. I spent probably half of my time in that archive, and I also just, while I was in the library, went up to the map room, obviously the Vivian Harsh collection, and the others that you see there. And so I was busy the whole time I was there, and so I got a lot done while I was there. Now, inside the Regenstein Library was the jazz archive, and in particular the John Steiner collection, which is massive. It is something. It's like close to 500 boxes of material. Of course, I didn't need to go through all of those, but I went through a lot of them. And in there, I found a number of things. I found really nice photographs for illustrating what I think will be the book, including this photo on the left of Walter Barnes and his Royal Creolians. There is Dave Payton at center. And the reason he left his post at the Defender was his orchestra. He headed up the Regal Theater Orchestra. And then on the right is Earl Hines's orchestra. Now, how do these people connect together is an interesting thing. While I was doing research, one of the things that this particular collection has are individual files on jazz musicians. And there was one on Walter Barnes in this collection. It wasn't large, but there were some details in it that were very, very interesting to me. One of which was just a little piece of paper, and all it had on it was Ed Burke says that Walter Barnes was substituting for Earl Hines on the night the Rhythm Club burned. In other words, Earl Hines's band was the one that was supposed to have been there the night of the fire, which would have changed jazz history in a major way because Earl Hines is considered one of the best jazz pianists of all time. Well, the reason this piqued my curiosity was like, who is Ed Burke, first of all? Well, it turns out that Ed Burke is a trombonist, and here he is up in this corner of the top left behind in the Walter Barnes photograph. And he later became the trombonist for the Earl Hines Orchestra. So it made sense to me then that Ed Burke, this trombonist, would have known that that was the truth. And then I followed that up by looking at a biography, an autobiography of Earl Hines, and in that Earl Hines says he basically confirms it. This is what was supposed to happen. We were supposed to be there, but Walter Barnes ended up taking the gig. And so some of the things I found in this particular archive were just helped me to understand Walter Barnes's world, why we don't know as much about him. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with the segregation of jazz in Chicago. The jazz magazines, in some part, really tell the story of that segregation. Um, from Downbeat Magazine, which was the Chicago-based jazz magazine, and where you see here, and they're asking the question, should Negro musicians play in white bands, which strikes me as odd, given that it's an African-American art form. And then you have these other magazines. Now, Swing Magazine tended to have on its cover white musicians, and you can't get any more white than a man named Paul Whiteman. And anyway, but there were also European jazz magazines in this collection, including Hot Jazz out of Paris, and so which was more likely to feature Black musicians, and that tended to be a place where Black jazz musicians wanted to go. They wanted to go to Europe, where they were found more acceptance in those communities. But through these magazines kind of helped tell the tale of segregation in the jazz community, and including within the pages of some of these magazines. So these were really, really useful to my understanding of Walter Barnes's world. He's not featured in any of these magazines, but neither are most Black musicians, even in Downbeat Magazine. What you find in these is you get a handful of musicians that these publications would even pay attention to. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and sometimes Earl Hines, because Earl Hines was sort of a level just below Duke Ellington. But you couldn't ignore somebody as talented as Duke Ellington. But that meant that hundreds of musicians, including people like Walter Barnes, who were very talented, never got the press in any of these magazines. So that made their work a little bit harder. While I was there, I went into the map room of the library, and this was really interesting because one of the things I want to know is about the actual geography of the place. And one of the things I wanted to know about were, number one, where did Walter Barnes live? I had his address. It's now a series of condos, but I know where it is. I got to go on that street. And then I also where the Natchez Social and Civic Club of Chicago met. This was an important group. These were specifically migrants from Natchez, Mississippi, that went to Chicago, and they were really important in the aftermath of the fire because they raised money for the victims, and they also create a memorial that a group of them will take a bus and deliver to the town of Natchez in September, a few months after the fire. So while I'm looking at and you're looking at an empty lot, for me, it represents more than that. It represents a place that people gathered, and the maps that I was able to access lets me know what kind of building was there previously. I also went to Vivian Harsh Research Collection. This was really important to learn more about this man named David Kellum, and as well as the Chicago Defender. And there were also some jazz oral histories here. David Kellum is an important figure because he was a migrant from Greenville, Mississippi. He was a journalist for the Chicago Defender. And when the fire took place, Robert Abbott sends Dave Kellum down to Natchez to cover the story because he said he felt like, he's from Mississippi, he knows the people. So this is an important part of the story I'm trying to tell, is like how the Defender and the role that the Defender plays in actually getting the story of the fire out to the world. It turns out also that Dave Kellum is one of the founders of the Bud Billiken Parade. And this is confirmed in Timuel Black's work of biographies about Chicago. And you can see in the far left photo, Dave Kellum at the center of it. He's very young there. And this is during a Bud Billiken parade and picnic, very early 30s. So he's an interesting figure, and he will play a part in the story I will tell about the fire, but also just the importance of Chicago to Mississippians. I also had the chance to go to the Harold Washington Library because there was the records of the Local 208. Walter Barnes talked about the Local 208 a lot in his column for the Chicago Defender. And one of the things that they had at the library they happened to be photocopies, but it's fine. They worked for me, and it was the minutes of the board of directors. And what's interesting for me is, Walter Barnes appears in the minutes of these board meetings, because there would be people who would come in, and, there would be, they might have questions for him. It's like, why aren't you paying, members of your band a certain wage? Things like that. But then also there was this one account of Walter Barnes. It is basically his dues sheet. And while that may not seem like much, it is something important. It's like any details that I could find about Walter Barnes are important details. And you can see that he paid his dues, and it shows he died on the 23rd during the fire. And basically, there was a payout on his policy on May 3rd, 1940. Well, that's an interesting thing as well, because there was a member of his band, a man named Jesse Washington, who had not kept up with his dues. And when his widow went to seek get the union to fulfill the policy, they turned her down. And that's in the minutes of the meeting. But anyway, the Local 208 is very important. And one of the things I discovered, there are books that I need to read in order to about the 208, so I can learn more about that organization. One of the things I did was take a tour of Bronzeville. I had a friend of a friend who took me around to the places I wanted to see. And so we started at the monument to the Great Northern Migration, and then we went around the area. I love this map of Bronzeville. It's done in bronze. I wish I could have gotten a really good photo of the overall thing, because it is pretty large. But that thing is fascinating because it actually highlights the location of the various jazz clubs that Barnes talked about in his column and also sometimes played. The 8th Regiment Armory was a site of a lot of jazz concerts, and including the Duke Ellington when he would come to town. And Barnes and his orchestra played there as well. So I'm interested in these spaces. I was managed to get, a photo of the Savoy Ballroom when I was in the Jazz Archive, but Barnes also played there. And then the Chicago Defender office where he worked for all those years. And so that was part of it. And then, and a really kind of interesting thing that happened is like I learned about this, like the Sunset Cafe and the which became the Grand Terrace Jazz Club, was a really, really important jazz club. Um, is now a beauty supply. But if you walk in and you walk into the back of the store, there's a jazz mural on the back wall that predates 1950. And this is, and you can see this mural on the wall, which I think is real fascinating. So it gives me a sense of, the a club at the time, what they might have looked like, or what might have been there, and also just the scale and the size of a club. Um, I wanted also, as part of my tour of Bronzeville, went to by the Pilgrim Baptist Church, and of course, it's very sad for me to know that this important structure had burned, and I look forward to its revival. But I wanted to go there, because I wanted to get it to see, because all these people had attended. 15,000 people attended Walter Barnes' funeral, and in the days before, at the funeral home, 30,000 people went through that funeral home. Which means to me, and hopefully you and help you understand, is that Walter Barnes wasn't a nobody. We may not know who he is right now, but he was very much important to Chicago. He was important to the Bronzeville community. Junius Austin, who preached the funeral, he was the longtime pastor of Pilgrim Baptist. He's an interesting figure all by himself. There's a famous photo of Marcus Garvey in a car with his hat with plumes and his like uniform on, and sitting next to him is Junius Austin. And so he's an interesting figure in his own right. But I wanted to, a sense of this. If you're there, you think about where would 15,000 people, gather. It would have been all up and down the streets and side streets around Pilgrim Baptist. Just to give myself, an opportunity to experience a jazz lounge from the period, I went to the Green Mill Lounge, which of course is on the north side. It's not on the south side. But they played 20s jazz, and you got a sense of, sort of a club's interior. Of course, this is only a fraction of the size of what extended down an entire block, but it was important for me because I wanted to hear the jazz, and they were playing 20s jazz, which is what Walter Barnes would have done, and so I took in this club. And then finally, I just want to talk about, how this project really reshaped the project I'm working on. When I first started working on this, and on my very first shot at a proposal for this book, it was really focused on Natchez and the fire. And I didn't even think about, like all the different connections, Chicago connections that I should have been thinking about. And I think the fellowship helped me do that. And now I'm looking at it as something that was an important story in the larger diaspora, and especially of the migration, because there's Walter Barnes who migrated. There's a Natchez Club. There's the Chicago Defenders coverage of what happened here by another Mississippi migrant to Chicago. So I think that's important in telling the story. Jazz is more central part of my story because it wasn't just New Orleans musicians that came to Chicago. A lot of them from all throughout the South, including Barnes and others. Jesse Washington, the other guy who one of his bandmates who died in the fire was also from Vicksburg, Mississippi. Um, I think I'm rethinking and seeking to focus more on the Great Migration as this movement. It's constant and in constant motion. So Barnes, for example, he goes to Chicago to get away from Mississippi, but he ends up coming back to Mississippi, and Mississippi takes his life, but he has to, because if he wants to earn a living, he has to return to Southern communities to do that. Because right after the Depression, the segregation of jazz in Chicago meant that white musicians insisted that they get gigs first when those things started opening up. So he basically um, made a way out of that by going to the South, and he called it going on one night jumps. So he was traveling all the time. When you read his column, it's exhausting to think about all of that, but it's really interesting about him going back home. And I see it now as a much broader tragedy than just in Natchez. And I think Barnes is really central to the story. I think Barnes is going to be a real important figure in helping me tell this broader story. And even more, like I said, than I realized before. And finally, it just changed my, like how I'm going to title this thing. It's called Going Home, Jazz, the Great Migration, and the Forgotten Saga of the Rhythm Club Fire. So we'll still talk about the Rhythm Club Fire, but the story is now broadened to encompass the importance of Chicago. And so I'm so grateful for that. I have a Facebook page for anybody's interested. It's just called the Rhythm Club Book in Progress, just because most people know me through that, or it's kind of how I started it off. And going home is an interesting, has a various meanings. Going home means going home is the title of a gospel hymn, and it was sung at Walter Barnes's funeral. Going home is about going back south, but it's also about going back to Chicago. So again, I just want to say just how grateful I am for this fellowship, and how important it was to me fleshing out this story. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, I just need to say it's a real treat, Dr. Cox, every time I get to hear you speak or see you present. So thank you for that informative and amazing talk. Um, it makes my heart really full because for so long it seemed like the Great Migration had fallen from grace or fallen out of favor. But there's a lot of good work being done on it at this point, and I feel like it's back. So your work is such an important contribution to African American history, Southern history, certainly. And of course, it expands the history of, kind of urban history and that of the Great Migration. So that being said, we will open the Q&A session with a couple of questions. And then those of you who are in attendance, you can maybe write your questions in the chat, or I guess just feel free to say something where there's a little bit of dead air there. So first, your project title, which has changed, but it was The World of Walter Barnes, Jazz Journalism and the Cultural Geography of Bronzeville. So it introduced kind of this cultural geography that existed in Bronzeville, and this kind of city within a city. But what did that cultural landscape look like? You talked a little bit about it, but what did it look like at the time?
Okay. Well, that title is really still the title it was the title for my fellowship. So that was still it. The title of my book changed. That's a different title for the fellowship. But anyway, yeah, I think that for me, it's the cultural geography are these like landmarks, right, of what was there, and trying to identify that. They were the jazz clubs first and foremost that he performed in. It was the spaces that he worked in. They were the churches. They were, um, you know, in the ways in which things move once the Savoy Ballroom opens up and the Regal Theater opens up. It moves, it shifts the center of Bronzeville from where it had been, which had been, the stroll. For me, it's just like it's actually that physical space, but it's also the culture that happens in that physical space. And so it's a rich cultural geography to me. It's a rich place. And it's also sad to see that so much of that has been destroyed over time. And it began in the 30s, those places, but they're so important and critical to understanding his world. It's like if he walks out the door of his place, his home, what does he see? Right. And he can walk, because I went and did it, right? You can walk 2 blocks to where Louis Armstrong lived with his wife, Lil, at the time, his then wife, Lil Hardin Armstrong. What does it look like if he's like, how long does it take for him to go from one place to another in the town, in the Bronzeville area? What is the differences, it's like between, I also kind of drove around and got to where the stockyards were, right? So that's also part of the landscape or of the geography that he knows and engages with. Some of his musicians are working at in these stockyards. And they're also working in these different clubs, like the Plantation Cafe. Okay, that right there gives you an indication. The name Plantation Cafe tells you something about the southernness of that geography, why they would use the Cotton Club. It's the same thing. There was a Cotton Club in Harlem that tries to recreate a plantation scene. There's a Cotton Club in Cicero that's doing something very similar. And if you look at the photograph of Walter Barnes in the Cotton Club, while he's dressed in a tuxedo, his band, they're in overalls. So I think that I appreciate, Eve, your own work on this about migrants, because I think there is something to that. It is the southernness of that culture geography that I think that really stands out for me. I don't know if I answered that right.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
my stab at it.
Perfect. And I'm also curious as to, okay, so a lot of people say when they think about Chicago, oh, Chicago's a great city to visit. There's, the food, and the food is good. Did you eat while you were visiting?
Well, yeah. Or I would have starved.
So the food is so good. No, the architecture is great. And they say all these things are really fabulous. But I think people underestimate the world-class archives that we have here in the city. So my question for you is, what was your biggest find in the archive?
Well, I think the biggest find for me was the one I mentioned earlier, that one little slip of paper that said it wasn't supposed to be Walter Barnes that night. It's supposed to have been Earl Hines. And like I said, that would have changed jazz history in a major way. I don't know if, how well-versed people are in the Chicago jazz here, or even just jazz generally. Earl Hines is like really central and key to that. And I just think that to me was like the most important find, because it leads to other things, right? You find one thing and then it's like, then you go, it connects to something else and something else. So it connected me to a biography. And I was like, oh, I can confirm this. Turns out in that biography, Earl Hines says one of his bandmates was in Natchez before he moved to Chicago. So he said, well, we played there all the time. We would stop there and play that town all the time. And so I think that that's important to just like, for me, it helped me connect Natchez in another way with Chicago. I want to say too, just as an aside, that little Facebook page I told you I started, somebody in Chicago is working on the Club de Lisa, and they reached out to me and mentioned Dempsey Travis and his books on Chicago, but he has one called An Autobiography of Chicago Jazz. That thing is like, I don't know, 500 pages. I don't know. It is fascinating. It is fascinating. It's such a great book. And I bought another one of his books because I just think it's so great. Turns out, and I didn't know it then when I was in Chicago, but it turns out that his papers are at the Vivian Harsh collection. They're not processed, but I hope I have a chance to see them because I am doing a presentation at the Organization of American Historians meeting in April. So I'll be back to Chicago and we'll take an extra day so I can go down there and see.
Awesome. I'll be quiet. I've got lots more questions, but I'll be quiet. Any questions from attendees?
I wanted to congratulate you, Professor Cox, on your work. And I'm sure you had a great time in Chicago. I would have been happy to take you on a tour myself. I'm actually the Bernard Turner. I'm the executive director of the Bronzeville Black Metropolis National Heritage Area. And we are very, very interested in learning more about the connections between our National Heritage Area and Mississippi, and specifically the connections with music and connections with the people. So congratulations on your work. I'm looking forward to reading more about it and welcome you to check out our website and newsletter as you move forward in your work. So thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you when I was there, but perhaps in the spring when I'm back.
Would be great.
Is it?
The way it looks like there's a hand raised. Samaya Ahmed.
Dr. Ahmed.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I know you probably do this in the book, but I was just wondering as I was listening to your presentation, I was hoping to get can you give us a sense of the kind of, we have, generally you say certain famous musicians and people have a sense of what their style was, what their music was. Can you give us a sense of what we missed with his passing? And also, are there any recordings of his band playing is what I was wondering if you're able to find any of those.
Yeah. Okay. So there are the recordings of our early 28, 29 on Brunswick Records. As I think I mentioned earlier, you can listen to these on Spotify because I've found them there. And they're also on YouTube, even if you don't have that. I tell you, one of the things about Walter Barnes is, and I haven't written the book, by the way, so it's the book, it's in progress. But one of the things about him that I recognize is that whereas Duke Ellington is not just a musician, he's a composer and an arranger. Walter Barnes is a showman and a journeyman. Walter Barnes knows how to take that music and interpret it for the public audiences. And so if you're like, he got a bump in the jazz world when he made those recordings in 28 and 29. But then what happens? Great Depression hits, right? And he's got to figure out how to continue to be a practicing musician and earn a living at it, which means he goes on the road. The thing he doesn't do is compose music. He started to do that in I think in 1938, but he was still on the road. He was on the road a lot. So, I wonder if, because he was so young still, he was 34 when he died, if he might have taken the time to start composing music. I think he saw that there was change, like swing music. There was you could see that it was ending. It was coming to an end on the horizon. He recognizes it. I think one of the things about Walter Barnes, even though he's not composing it and everything, he has his finger on the pulse of what's going on, and what's working. And I like to tell this story if you don't mind. In his column in 1931, Duke Ellington is playing at the Lincoln Tavern, and Barnes goes down to hear him. He goes to the club, to Lincoln Tavern, and Barnes says, I go in there, and he says, and Duke Ellington is working on a new song. And he told me, and I don't know if this is true, he relays a conversation, but he says, Walter, I'd like Walter, you and your boys to try this tune out in your band. And Walter Barnes says, and the name of the song is It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing. So he's there at the birth of that famous jazz song. So he's engaging with people. He meets the people that we all know more about. And I think you can tell in his column, he really wants to be in that upper echelon. But the thing I think about him, I consider him like a journeyman, right? He takes that music and he spreads it across the South, because Chicago changes jazz, right? It's not the same as it was in New Orleans. And so I just feel like he does that, and he's a good representative of that. And he's a hustler. I say he's a hustler. He's gonna make his coins, and when he's able to buy his wife a new Lincoln convertible in the mid-30s, there's a picture of them in it in the Chicago Defender to showcase that because he had made money. He bought buses and rented them out to churches. He was making money here and there. He was doing a little bit of everything, but I wonder what he would have become. When you're only 34, would he have done what, Earl Hines did? Because they were contemporaries.
Thank you for that. And I was just one thing that I was thinking about is, the Oxford English Dictionary is doing this study of African American vernacular English. One of the things they focus on is on different terms for different kinds of music. And I know that they're trying to chart the origins of a lot of words related to jazz. And so they are, and I've been told that someone working on that project that they've been able to tie most words are either they're saying from, it's interesting, the person didn't mention New Orleans, they mentioned Harlem and Chicago, but it would be interesting to see, although in Chicago, whether or not those words actually can be linked to other places, right, to the South, back to the South. So I don't know if that might be of interest to you as well, but thank you very much.
I appreciate that.
Other questions? I'm curious, is that term for his band, the Royal Creoleans, is that because he had some New Orleans ancestry or where it began? Or is it because because it was a jazz band? Is there any indication of that?
I'm not quite sure where that comes from. I'd heard, I feel like I've seen a reference to maybe there was another group with Creoleans in it, and maybe he adopted that. But it's not really clear to me, exactly where that came from. But imagine that, because I imagine there's like Creole people that are there in Chicago. Maybe he's thinking about it in that way, and maybe that appeals to Southern migrants. That's a good question, though.
I assume, well, speaking of the Royal Creoleans, that some of the others in the band perished in the fire, but is there anything you were able to track about what, if any survived, and if they were able to carry on. I don't know. I mean, it was such a massive fire.
It was. There was most of them perished. I think the drummer made it out, and because he's interviewed in the after the fire,
Mm.
and he says, "I'll never hit him again," meaning that he's not going to hit those drums again. I don't know if I haven't followed up on that to see if that was the case, but
Mm.
clearly it was so traumatic to him, because he was the one
Yes.
that got out. But yeah, of course, but I think something like, I don't know how many people were in it. I want to say 14, maybe. I want to say at least 9 of them died. Yeah.
Your project seeks to correct you talk about this historical erasure of Barnes that's happened because, like you said at the beginning, not many people, have heard of him or were aware of him. So do you have any clues as to why a man who was so well loved,
Mhm.
like you said, 15,000 people showed up at his funeral?
Yeah.
But, any idea about why a man who was so well loved seemed to have been forgotten or erased so quickly?
What's interesting, I think the entire fire got erased quickly, and all those victims, including Walter Barnes. I I think there's, I haven't come to a conclusion, but I think there are some things that may have had an impact. One is um, the um, the Second World War, and it's in the news all the time, and so they're moving on to other, major events or major things that happen in the world that are affecting African Americans. Um, what is, because the Chicago Defender does a big, basically gives up the entire issue for May 4th over to the fire. And I think it's because of his youth too, right? He wasn't, and he hadn't played, he wasn't a Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong. He was not in that level of jazz musicians. I think that's part of it. Then there was a fire in 1942 in Boston called the Coconut Grove Fire that I think just erased the whole what had happened in Natchez. But people didn't care about really when it seems to me like the only difference between the two and how it got covered was race, because white papers did not cover this story. So this is such a good question because I'm not sure why unless, you know, I think people like there are probably was a preservation of oral traditions around him, but after several generations, I'm not sure I could access them at this point. But I feel like there were, and I also think his wife, because I think she left Chicago after that, I think she ends up going to California. That's something I need to confirm as well. So I'm not really, I don't know that. And I think I've got to come to that, figuring that out as I get to that point.
Interesting. Okay. Well, looks like we're out of time. I could go on and on, but I'll turn it back over to Allison.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Wade. And thank you very much, Dr. Cox, for sharing with us your research on a figure that, yes, most of us should know more about. So we anxiously look forward to the eventual book that you are writing on Walter Barnes. And do keep us posted, of course. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Dr. Wade, thank you. Good to have you as a former fellow yourself to engage with Dr. Cox on this topic and to be with us today as well.